I kinda feel weird talking about the authenticity of Hulu's slice of life dramedy series, Reservation Dogs. Like, I'm a white guy from South Texas, and with a simple search you can find a plethora of perspectives from actual Native Americans on the show's depiction of reservation life, how it weaves traditional indigenous folklore and beliefs in a modern setting, or how Sterling Harjo both subverts and reclaims the stereotype of the stoic movie Indian.
Oh, creator. Thank you for these sacred tater tots that my nephew, grandson, grandpa here has given me. Take care of his little heart like that and his cholesterol in that good way. Ahoo.
All I really have to add in that regard is that it's pretty cool to actually see indigenous people presented in the present tense, rather than only as figures in westerns and period pieces about colonialism. No, the authenticity of Res Dogs for me is a quality that I find harder to place. It's just a real show. Like the realest show on television. From little moments like the titular gang hauling around a dead deer as their stoner uncle tries to sell dump weed, to heavier scenes like a father and daughter outpouring pent-up grief on a hunting trip. It's present in how the show is shot on an actual Oklahoma reservation, uses local, often amateur actors to fill out its tertiary cast, and in the casual, naturalistic vibe of the dialogue.
What kind of gang was both red and blue?
Indian Mafia. Couldn't make up their minds if they want to be Bloods or Crips more. Maybe they're Blips. Or maybe they're Cruds. Hey!
Why not just wear purple?
All things Harjo brought over from his indie film background. That specificity, ironically, is universal. And the show translates that through the lens of music. And holy crap, this soundtrack. From Oklahoma red dirt bands and native hip-hop groups to timeless country and classic rock standards, whispery indie folk, and even freaking stoner doom metal. And my hometown boy, Freddie Fender. I'm fairly certain music supervisor Tiffany Anders has been looking at my Spotify history. She finds the perfect blend of regional flavor, obscure deep cuts that set the laid-back, offbeat vibe of the show, with enough of a licensing budget to pull some all-time bangers. The soundtrack is a treasure trove of musical discovery, though what's great about the show itself is how the native perspective deepens my appreciation for music that I already know and love.
Hey everyone out there in Indian Territory, Oklahoma. You're listening to K49, Territory Jams. I'm your humble host, Jabon Bruner. Right now I'm taking you back to my snagging days with a little band called the Stooges with I Wanna Be Your Dog. Sound like a shapeshifter song to me. Anyway, take it away, Iggy. My dog.
The very first voice you hear on the pilot episode is that of a reservation radio DJ, setting the eclectic sound of the show. And bam! The Stooges tear it up as the Reservation Dogs gang steals a truck full of off-brand flaming hot Cheetos. They intend to flip both the truck and the chips for cash, in order to escape the dull res life for presumably greener pastures in faraway California. As they pull into the neighborhood fence/salvage yard/meth lab, the music cools to a guitar lick familiar to anyone who's watched Pulp Fiction. Link Wray was one of the foundational innovators of rock and roll, whose distorted instrumental riffs were so raw, authorities banned his music for fear that it would incite criminality. Wray was also Native American, a Shawnee, and his inclusion among other indigenous artists on the soundtrack is itself an act of cultural reclamation by Harjo. Like for many disenfranchised groups in America, criminality has been intertwined with Native American history, from Comanche cattle raids to Wild West outlaws like the Rufus Buck Gang, to more contemporary criminal activity found in impoverished communities. Ray's music, no pun intended I swear, links that outlaw heritage to these wayward res kids, yearning to break free from the cycle, which is then followed by the title card and the freaking Wu-Tang Clan, 2 generations of what Steven Van Zandt called the soundtrack to juvenile delinquency. The most immediately striking musical voices on Reservation Dogs come from native hip-hop artists like Stin, Jody, and Little Mike and Funny Bone, who all play versions of themselves on the show. So much of the cultural signifiers of that genre are embedded in the reservation, from grills to gold chains and even vocal affect. Cultural appropriation in hip-hop is already a third rail of discourse, further electrified by centuries of intermarriage that has complicated the racial identity of Native Americans. I'm not gonna get bogged down into what makes one a culture vulture, because the music here so very clearly comes from a deep personal place for these artists, a perspective that is unmistakably Native. Showrunner Sterling Harjo said in an interview with Salon, "When you have a culture where their identity has been stripped away through genocide, hip-hop was there to help us out with our identity, I think. So it has a profound effect in Native communities because it wasn't white. And there's something very punk rock, very standing up to the man about it. That's something that we identified with and needed to do ourselves." Once again, it's that present tense of action that drives both the show and the characters. Midway through the pilot episode, Bear, the self-appointed leader of the Res Dogs, is visited by the spirit of a schlubby Native American warrior, played pitch perfectly by Dallas Goldtooth, who died a not very glorious death smothered by his own horse. Nevertheless, he asks questions that are fundamental not just to indigenous people, but to men all over.
Being a warrior, it's not always easy. You and your thuggy-ass friends, what are you doing for your people? It's easy to be bad, but it's hard to be a warrior with dignity. Remember that. In my time, we gave everything. We died for our people. We died for our land. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna fight for? Ah! Nah, I'm just fucking with you. But for real though, listen to what I said. Marinate on it. Oh.
The petty crime and gang war subplots are placed by the wayside, in favor of episodes where each character tries to find answers to those questions. Come and Get Your Love is the title of both the indelible 1974 hit song by Redbone and of the 5th episode of Season 1. The latter follows Big, the reservation's deputy police officer, on a ride-along training day style with one of the Res Dogs named Cheese. On patrol, he's a Keystone cop, who, rather than busting thieves, spends most of his time watching conspiracy theory videos in his broke-ass police cruiser. He gets emasculated by the better-equipped county sheriff's department and is seemingly outwitted by the teenage delinquents of the res. It's no surprise that his favorite song evokes disco cheese. But you know what? Come and Get Your Love is an immaculately crafted piece of pop music that's so timeless that even my 8-year-old nephew loves to groove to it. And as Big explains to Cheese, Redbone were native, which I didn't even know. I mean, they never really hid their heritage. In fact, they fully embodied it in their stage performances and in the lyrics of their lesser hits. However, in the decades since, the greater pop culture kind of flattened Redbone's legacy to just being a cheesy one-hit wonder, even if that's technically not true. For Big, they were a point of pride, coming about in a time in his childhood when Native American iconography was more present than ever in the mainstream, but rarely performed by actual natives. Once again, Harjo brings it back to that word, reclamation, including actual concert footage in the credits to show Big wasn't just bullshitting. Even with the hazy nonsense lyrics, Come and Get Your Love emits both the good vibes and even a sting of melancholy that defines Big's soulful outlook on the world. He may not be a great cop, but Big's light touch to policing is born out of a moral code that stamps out actual evil and shows grace to misguided souls who are just trying to do good. On the ride-along, he and Cheese track down a copper thief, which leads them to Bucky, one of the town drunks. He had lifted the wiring from a meth dealer and fashion them into little totems to ward off bad medicine around town. He frames his actions as a service for the community, taking away from the people who flood the streets with drugs, while spreading the word about the antimicrobial powers of copper. The science is a bit iffy on that, though nevertheless, Big lets Bucky go, because he's one of the good ones, and throwing the book at him and locking him in jail would only needlessly hurt the community. We find out in Season 2 that Big watched his childhood friend Cookie fall into a bad crowd that led to her death, and drove him to become a light horseman. Once again, Big is terrible at law enforcement, but is the platonic ideal of the phrase to protect and serve. A man who polices with open arms, rather than a clenched fist. And I just love the casting of both Don McLaren and Wes Studi here. Two actors who are usually typecast in other movies as the stereotypical stoic Indian, bringing that same gravitas to otherwise goofball comic characters, which really epitomizes the whole tone of the series.
All right, well, get home. Park this truck where it belongs. Do me a favor, Bucky. Stop putting little men on porches. Shit your freaking fuckers out all over town, man.
Yeah, well, that's what's up, you know. Word is bond. And, hey, little man.
Yeah.
We need you out on the streets fighting bad guys like Big here, you know. He's one of the good ones. 'Cause we was raised right, ain't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get home.
The men of Reservation Dogs remind me so much of the male characters of Taika Waititi, torn apart by grief, absorbing the toxic and chauvinistic culture around them, and yearning to fit a masculine ideal while still clinging to the juvenilia of their youth. Though ultimately they're all fundamentally good at heart, just needing a bit of a moral nudge in the right direction. Like a Waititi film, every character on Reservation Dogs, including the women, is defined by their father, or especially the lack thereof. In Season 1, the return of his deadbeat dad to the res essentially turns Bear back into a little boy, desperate to win the approval of a man who barely can't be bothered to participate, even in the most superficial ways. Elora Danan has even less. A completely absent father, a dead mother, and an ailing grandmother, who's completely checked out. Her Uncle Brownie is stoned out of his mind. The only other male figure in her life is her old basketball coach, played by Bill Burr. And, well, he's a Bill Burr character.
Hang on, go around, asshole! Go around, there's plenty of room! Dickhead! Oh, shit, did I bump it?
Cheese, well, he's just super zen in a way I identify with. Like Big, he's so full of inherent goodness that he can find peace and connection with just about anyone in town. Willie Jack is the only one with a traditional family structure still intact, and even then the loss of her cousin Daniel put an unspoken strain on them. For the first time since his death, Willie Jack and her father, Leon, go out on a hunting trip onto the lands of Texas ranchers. The song Paul Harjo and Anders used for this episode is Daddy and Home by the singing brakeman, the father of country music, Jimmy Rogers. He plays over a scene of Willie Jack and her dad goofing around with some egregiously poor gun safety that kinda drove me nuts. Anyway, Daddy and Home is melancholy on two layers. First, as a song about a train worker yearning for the comfort and love of family. But also because Rogers lost an infant daughter, and he himself died tragically of tuberculosis, for which his father had the unimaginable tragedy of burying his own son. Leon faced a similar grief with the sudden death of his nephew, and now his own daughter wants to leave the only home she knew for California. But as wounded as he is by the former, he's strangely at peace with the latter. If only because he doesn't want the res to kill Willie Jack like it did Daniel. Everything about the episode is so delicate. The soft-spoken bond between father and daughter, the balance of life and death in the forest, the low-key colloquial humor of Willie Jack.
What's up, White Jesus?
And then it builds and builds until the grief can't be held back anymore. And boy, does it wallop you in the feels. Part of that is that up until that point, she was just the resi member of the gang, who always had a slangy quip to throw out. Then suddenly, both Willie Jack and Paulina Alexis as a performer blossom with depth that you didn't realize they had. And in that instant, she becomes the heart and soul of the show.
Everyone wants to leave to California, but it's really hard leaving everyone here. I don't know how you did it. Maybe you didn't know, but I'm not mad at you anymore. In case you were hungry.
Hunting is easily the best episode of the series. Everything is pitch perfect. The weaving of indigenous folklore, the needle drops. Sturgill Simpson is a goddamn poet. Hell, even the political satire highlights a rural version of gentrification. By season 2, Willie Jack grows into the spiritual leader of the gang, who can bring a sense of healing, even in the cold walls of a prison. Bear does something of the sort in season 2 as well. He only knows the kind of man he doesn't want to be, but envisioning the ideal man he does want to become is a lot harder. In an attempt to fit the traditional masculine mold, he starts working as a roofer, the most red-blooded blue-collar job one could do on the res. Still, Bear resembles more a kid playing at being grown up, and his co-workers don't have any interest in teaching him, insisting that he learns the native way. That is, totally on your own, without any guidance, and expecting to fuck up. For boys with absent fathers, it's sometimes the only way to learn. But for the fathers who do stick around, it's a cop-out philosophy. One of which is Danny, the one quiet and dependable roofer who we find out is the neglectful alcoholic father of Daniel. Daniel was a kid who struggled with mental health issues, and his tumultuous home life and the reservation itself was killing him. He's the very reason the Res Dogs wanted to escape to California in the first place. But before they could, everything became too much, and Daniel committed suicide. That very he'll figure it out attitude, that abdication of fatherhood, is why Bear's dad abandoned him, and is partially what killed his friend Daniel. Bear carries a venom for men like him, palpable in Tefera Wunatai's performance. Danny is even worse than a deadbeat, a man whose very presence was destructive. During the lunch break, Bear snipes at Danny for being a fuck-up father. But instead of escalating into a confrontation, Danny just takes it. The spirit appears to Bear during a porta-potty break, guiding him to the realization that both he and Danny share a similar grief.
Yo, we mourn them. We cut our hair. We cut ourselves. We go through all the feels. We airbrush their faces on our t-shirts, get their names tattooed on our bodies in Old English script. We tear ourselves to pieces so that we can build ourselves new on the other side.
He apologizes to the man, who reveals that in the years since his son's death, he had taken full responsibility and sobered up. Danny even teaches Bear how to properly nail a roof tile, and then drops one of the realest moments of the show.
You know I was a shitty dad. So you're gonna grow up and be a man. And a man isn't someone who walks around and makes mistakes in hopes that they're gonna do better. That's what a shit-ass does. A man knows that whatever he does has consequences. So you gotta be good the first time around.
The tragedy is that Danny gained that wisdom at an immense cost, a part of him that will never be fully recovered or healed. He speaks of a masculinity that's far more than just tool belts and sweaty work, but of thoughtful action, conscious growth, and guidance, even if you yourself don't have it all figured out. What I find most resonant about Reservation Dogs are these imperfect, sometimes broken men, who nevertheless try to live up to this standard and do right by the younger generation. Grief is perhaps the most prominent theme of Reservation Dogs, embodied in the song that plays in the pilot episode, Joey, by Choctaw singer-songwriter Samantha Crane. Like in the lyrics, ghostly apparitions haunt the characters of the show. In flashback, as the legendary Lakota spirit, the Tall Man, or as heavenly lights during golden hour. The cyclical stasis of their lives echo the refrain, "I am a revolving door." Especially Alora. She was closest to Daniel, the one who first found his body hanging from the gang's hideout spot. Grief is her entire existence. Even when she finally leaves the res, tragedy, the death of her grandmother, pulls her back in. It's harder to pick a favorite episode from Season 2, but I do dig the hangout vibes of Mabel. It feels like Harjo and company really wanted to do an episode like this, and we're just waiting for COVID restrictions to lift. The impending death of Alora's grandmother is not a cause of mourning or gnashing of teeth, but a celebration of life, a moment where the community can be as one. And yet, Alora has never felt more alone. I said this was a hangout episode, but in truth, there's a lot of moving parts, and we finally get more of a backstory for the adults of the community. As it turns out, and boy do we love this phrase now, generational trauma is cyclical, and the generation before the Res Dogs also grappled with the sudden death of their friend, Elora's mother, Cookie. It's a deceivingly complex 30 minutes of television, where all these interlocking threads somehow never take away from the central arc of Alora being able to properly grieve for the first time. Musically, the funeral rites of Okern bring out the familiar sounds of old-time gospel tunes, though sung in the native tongue of the Muskogee. Nowadays, Christianity is framed as a historically antagonistic force to indigenous people, a tool of colonialism, and that was true, and in many respects still is today. One of the developments in Season 2 is the encroachment of white evangelical missionaries and megachurches onto tribal lands, an issue that's been happening on real-life reservations. Though like many indigenous groups all over the Western Hemisphere, the Muskogee embrace a rich syncretism of traditional beliefs and practices with the structure of the Christian church. As a non-native, I was surprised how much of the religious expression in Reservation Dogs resembled the churches I grew up in. The style of prayer and song, the aesthetic of the church building.
So, white Jesus?
The importance of women as spiritual intercessors, and of course, Southern fried cooking as a communal experience. I don't see that aspect of Christianity presented in media, much less this uniquely native form of it.
You know, Jesus and me, we're like this, brothers. Two brown men, both cut down in the prime of their life. Yeah. Body of Christ?
No.
You're lost.
It informs the entire ethos of the show. Redemption, spiritual reclamation, walking the narrow path in spite of the environment around you, and the healing power of community. Bucky's arc embodies all of that. He and fellow tribal elder Brownie have been through the shit. Breakups and benders and bar fights, unimaginable grief and alienation. And they haven't emerged from it in one piece. They had a falling out over one snagging the other's ex-girlfriend, and haven't talked to each other in 30 years, which, considering the small size of Okern, is quite the feat. However, when the Res Dogs turn to them to lift a curse, they themselves must mend the damage of their own relationship, which first involves a hilariously TMI passive-aggressive prayer.
Creator! Thank you, Creator, for giving me the ability to forgive past transgressions and to look past other people's shortcomings.
Well, Creator, they ain't that short, my coming.
Oh,
Ho-ho!
And then an invocation of an old holy song of wisdom.
She's a good girl, loves her mama, loves Jesus and America too.
I'm not gonna lie, the wavelength of Reservation Dogs' humor is very sensible chuckle. It never made me burst out laughing. Until that moment. These 70-year-old men, legendary actors, wailing Tom Petty, offbeat and off-key, and it's kind of profound. Forgiveness and reconciliation, a spiritualism rooted in both Christianity and traditional native religions, expressed through a 30-year-old song about being a bad boy in LA. It ends up being the anthem of Season 2, the act of letting go, and in the process overcoming the fear of feeling weightless and unmoored. Bucky and Brownie must relinquish the burdensome melancholy of young love. Big has to let go of the guilt of Cookie's death, as does Bear for the death of Daniel. Willie Jack has to grow out of petty grudges and become a figure of unity. And when the gang finally reaches the shores of the Pacific Ocean to fulfill Daniel's California dream, it's that same healing song, sung naturally by Willie Jack, that pushes Elora towards the water to cleanse herself of the grief. Reservation Dogs has been rightfully lauded for bringing an authentic, modern Native American perspective to such a prominent platform. But I think its appeal to a broader non-Native audience really stems from how well it expresses post-COVID angst.
Look at me. You think I like having this job? You think I wanted to be out here this long? 10 fucking years. I don't have a family. I got nothing. I'm sick of it. I just want to go back from where I'm from.
China?
No, you shit. I grew up in San Diego. I'm Korean, not Chinese. What the?
How sudden the mass deaths were. How little time we were given to properly grieve over them. How we balance our individual desires against the responsibility to our community. How we can reclaim what was lost and heal what was broken. Season 2 ends with the gang potentially stranded in California without a car, and without a place to stay for the night. But it almost doesn't matter, because at that moment, the Res Dogs are whole again, including Daniel. The camera pulls out on one last piece of magical realism, White Jesus combing the beach, revealing Tim Capello, the muscular sax player from Cheese's favorite movie, The Lost Boys, singing the film's iconic song, I Still Believe.
Oh, I still believe.
Make it up as we go along. I still